I want to welcome everyone joining us this morning. There are a lot of us here in the room, but we also have over 300 people joining us online. And it is really exciting to have so many people come together from all around the world for this very special keynote. I'm Dr. Vanessa Ashall. I'm Human-Animal Interaction Technical Leader at the Waltham Pet Care Science Institute, based in the UK. I'd like to thank both ISAS and Positive Connections Lab at the University of Saskatchewan for kindly inviting me here today. It's an honour to be here and a privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Losey, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. Dr. Losey's work explores the archaeology of human-animal relationships, with a particular focus on the domestication of both dogs and reindeer. His fieldwork has taken him across the North American and Siberian Arctic and into the prairies of Saskatchewan. In recent studies, he and his team have examined how access to human food influenced canine evolution in the Arctic, as well as how trade and migration shaped the genetic legacy of prehistoric dogs. Beyond his extensive zooarchaeological research, Dr. Losey is also active in ethnoarchaeology and the broader field of human-animal studies. His interests extend to other Arctic species. For example, in his 2023 study, he and his colleagues investigated Holocene-era seal hunting at Lake Baikal, comparing remains dating back 9,000 years with modern seal skeletons. He earned his BSc in anthropology from Kansas State University, followed by an MSc and PhD in archaeology from the University of Oregon. Since joining the University of Alberta, he's become a full professor and continues to teach and mentor the next generation of archaeologists. Dr. Losey's dedication to his research is truly inspiring. I'm sure you'll find his session today, Becoming Friends with Animals, Lessons from History and Culture, as fascinating as I will. And today, Dr. Losey will talk about how domestication has created strong, complex, and continually changing relationships between people and some animals. These shared multi-species histories date back thousands of years. We will hear that archaeology and ethnography provide fascinating insights into these relationships, but also reveal how science's portrayal of domestication has been misleading. Dr. Losey will show us how love, care, and commitment are essential to domestication and continue to shape how these relationships unfold. Following Dr. Losey's talk, Dr. Lindsay Williamson from the Positive Connections is going to be facilitating the question and answer session. So please put your hands together now and join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Losey.
Good morning. This is the first time I've spoken at an anthrozoology conference, and I was quite nervous, but I knew I was okay when I got to the lobby yesterday and there were dogs everywhere, and I was like, I'm in good company, so I'm going to be all right. You may think, archaeology is a weird discipline to talk about human-animal relationships, but the reality is that archaeology, and particularly anthropology, has a long-standing interest in human-animal relationships, and particularly has become a central area of research over the last 10 years or so. And a lot of that research has focused on something called domestication. And what sociocultural anthropology has taught us in particular is how complex, how variable these relationships are, how the domestication really is not one thing, but it is multiple things. It's an ongoing relationship. It involves care, it involves love, and it involves all the things that science often emphasizes as well, like influencing or controlling breeding and all these things that we consider to be the definition of domestication. And while those ideas are all over in the literature, the way in which domestication is actually portrayed in a lot of scientific literature is not like that at all. It's something quite different. It's something quite sterile. And I would say that the way in which domestication is portrayed is really, it has many kind of long-standing narratives that just won't go away. And those long-standing narratives are misleading, and they direct us away from the kind of relationships that I think most of us are actually most interested in. So I'm going to talk about some of those long-standing problematic narratives. I'll talk a little bit about the archaeology of dog domestication, and then some of our ethnographic work with Nenet's reindeer herders as counterexamples to these bizarre narratives. And I'm going to throw in a little bit of dog and reindeer bathroom humor, literally, just to keep you guys awake today, okay? So one of the longest standing lingering narratives in domestication is the notion that it involves a unidirectional relationship where humans are like the hand of God directing the evolution of an animal. And it is dominated by this notion of control. So I have a quote here from Juliette Clutton-Brock, a fantastic scholar, but she defined domestication in exactly this way. It's about control over breeding, it's about control over food, about control over territory. And there's been so many critiques of this, and really many people recognizing this is really kind of a definition of some forms of modern industrial agriculture rather than the various ways in which people have been with animals over the long term and here and now. In fact, what anthropology emphasizes for us is that domestications are really relationships, they're ongoing, and that our lives are as affected, our evolution is as affected as the animals that we are engaging with, that we depend upon, that we love on a day-to-day basis. So I'll talk about this a little bit going forward. And this is bathroom humor joke number one. My dog always reminds me that the notion that I am in control is false. So I have an very old 16-year-old black Labrador retriever, and she's about 80 pounds. I have to pick her up most every time she sits down. So it's 2 mornings ago, I'm drinking my coffee, I'm bleary-eyed, and I ran out of coffee, so I start to walk into the kitchen, get another cup of coffee. She wants up, so I pick her up, and then we go into the kitchen. She goes straight to the fridge, surprise, surprise, where she demands her morning treat, which is she loves turkey pepperoni. That's her thing. So she's got almost no teeth left, so I break it into little bits, and I feed her by hand, and then I pour myself a cup of coffee, and I go back to my chair, and I start to drink, and then my dog shows me her absolute gangster nature, and she walks into the living room, and she stares me straight in the eyes, and then she just relieves herself on the kitchen carpet. And I was just thinking to myself, maybe she wanted 2 pepperonis, but it's just a good reminder that we're not often as in control of these situations as we think we might be. All right, I'll hold off on the bathroom jokes for a while. Another lingering kind of myth that perpetuates discussions of domestication are that domestications were abbreviated events. They were revolutions. They were thresholds that were crossed in the past. And the graphic up here doesn't matter. The point is that domestication there is shown in the little red parts of the graphs, supposedly, and it's little bits of time, little periods in which people were controlling dog reproduction or sheep reproduction or chicken or whatever it was, and that somehow we cross this imaginary threshold and then something else starts to happen. And what the geneticists have told us, what anthropologists have told us, is that in fact domestication is not this thing that happened 10,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, but rather is an ongoing process. We're still involved in these relationships. We're still shaping each other's daily experiences, and we're really still affecting each other's evolution. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize, and that I'll show you particularly with our Nenet's host and their reindeer here a little bit later. Another issue that's becoming increasingly dominant in the literature is that domestication is portrayed as a bodily process and studied as a bodily process. And the reasons for this really relate to the analytical ways in which domestication is studied, particularly the long-term history of domestication. It's studied using ancient genomes. It's studying using morphology. And these are things that study bodies and how they change through time. They study evolution over the long term. And that really directs our attention to aspects of domestication, bodily changes. But it also shifts our attention away from the relationships of domestication. So while these tools are incredibly powerful and incredibly insightful, and I'm a part of some of that work, they also don't tell us the whole story. We focus on bodies rather than relationships, and because of that, we miss an important and oftentimes beautiful part of these relationships that many of us are involved in. The final little narrative that I think is lingering relates to how domestication is said to have happened. So these explanations run the gamut from total human intentionality to no human intentionality at all. So we'll take the example with dogs. So one of the ideas is that people created dogs by capturing wolf pups, intentionally breeding them, keeping them separate from wild wolves, and that eventually we had dogs as a result. It's human intention, it's human forethought, right? This is what we're going to create with dogs. At the opposite end of that spectrum is the animal-initiated hypothesis. And this is sort of, you could call it self-domestication. It has been called that. You could call it prosociality, with the idea here being that 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, people are living in and around wolves. A small subset of those wolves began to feed on our leftovers. And the wolves that were most stress-tolerant, that were most friendly, ended up kind of specializing in living in the human niche, and they begin to separate from their wild counterparts. So they sort of supposedly domesticate themselves, right? That's an interesting idea. But I don't see how with either of these we end up with Chihuahuas or Great Danes, right? There are other things that are involved here. And the reality of those two models is that it is a combination of both of those things rather than one of them exclusively. And they just supposedly, what they are about is how the process was initiated rather than how it was completed, right? Rather than thinking about thresholds, we're thinking about ongoing relationships. And there are other models as well. With reindeer, the common model that's offered is that people, in Central Asia had horses, they had cattle, they had sheep, they had goats for thousands of years. Their neighbors to the north in the boreal forest, they had a hard time keeping those animals in the boreal forest, but they were around reindeer, call them caribou here, all of the time, very well suited to boreal forest environment, and they simply borrowed the practices of keeping horses, applied them to their reindeer, and thus we had reindeer domestication, right? These are fables, these are stories. Most of them have little or no actual physical support in evidence of them. So with these kind of ideas in mind, I'd like to talk about the archaeology of dog domestication. Now, unfortunately, and I'm actually jealous of all of you guys. Like, I'm really interested in dogs, but I don't really work with dogs. I work with the bones of dogs, unfortunately, to try to tease out some of the things that you guys are interested in. And it's very, very challenging. But the important thing to recognize here is that research on dog domestication has been occurring for over a century. And right now, there are millions and millions of dollars being spent trying to figure it out. Millions and millions of euros being spent trying to figure it out, because most of the big funding for that kind of research is through the European Union. So this topic has been examined and examined and examined, and it's remarkable how much we still don't know about the process. But I'm going to show you what science thinks it knows so far, realizing that the story will probably change next week. Okay? So one of the things that I should say is, typically as an archaeologist, we study bones, as I said before, and one of the things that these new methods have shown us is really how to, most of the time anyway, tell whether we have an ancient dog or an ancient wolf in an archaeological site from 10,000 years ago. So methods like geometric morphometrics. So what they really show us in terms of the shape of the animal is that a wolf's head, shown on the top there, is quite wedge-shaped, right? It's quite wedge-shaped, if you can kind of look at its outline there, right? Whereas a dog has most dogs, not all dogs, but most dogs have a bit of a forehead, and that is because through the course of their evolution, their snouts have rotated upwards relative to their brain case. So it's a bit modular, right? Evolving somewhat independently. So you have dogs have a bit of a forehead, and then the jawbone the mandible has got to become, it has to accommodate that shape, and the jawbones of dogs become a little bit more arched when you look at them from the side compared to those of wolves. Now, all of this is misleading, actually, because there are some dogs that have heads that are shaped just like wolves. And most of the time, we don't uncover whole bones. We end up with bits and pieces, right? Single tooth, try to figure out whether you have a dog or a wolf. Well, you can't use these kind of analyses. We need other things. We need studies of ancient genomes to try to help us figure that out. And that's exactly what's being done. So the genomic research so far indicates that all dogs, everything, like I said, from Chihuahuas to St. Bernards, evolved from Eurasian wolves coming somewhere from Europe or Asia. And that relationship is extremely old. It began during the last ice age. Almost everyone would agree that it is at least 15,000 years ago when that process began. You'll read 30, 40,000 years ago by many other scholars. So it's very, very ancient. We don't know exactly when, and we also don't know exactly where. The genomics seems to indicate, at least to me, that it's most likely East Asia, Siberia, China, probably, but again, we'll see how this plays out. There's a lot of money being spent right now in laboratories analyzing ancient wolf remains and ancient dog remains, trying to limit that down to a place. So, I mean, we've limited it down to half the world and maybe over 15,000 years ago, but clearly we've got a lot left to be done here. The thing to realize about the genomic work, though, is that it's more complicated. Obviously, it seems complicated, but it's even more complicated than this complicated science seems. And I'll give you an example here from a paper we just published this last week. You might have seen it. It was featured on CNN this week. So this little pup here was frozen in the Siberian tundra for 14,000 years. And it was found eroding out of a bank by some herders about 10 years ago, reindeer herders. And they brought it to the scientists in Siberia. And there was huge excitement because everybody thought this was an very early domestic dog, because just a few hundred meters away, there was an archaeological site where people were butchering mammoth. And everybody's like, oh my God, here we have our origin dog, our earliest dog in the world, right in the Siberian Arctic, maybe where we would expect it. And then subsequently, there have been lots of studies of the animals, the pup's DNA, and what they could show through the genomics is that this pup was not ancestral to modern dogs. Not ancestral to modern dogs. There was a second one found just a few meters away. The genomics could tell that it was his brother, right? It can give us this type of information. It's amazing, actually. But the important thing to realize is that there's not a part of the genome that just signals domestication in all animals. So what genomics can tell us is whether ancient animals were ancestral to modern dogs, but it can't necessarily pick up all domestications, because there could have been these relationships that started, that lasted for 500 years, for 1,000 years, and then they didn't continue. And therefore, we don't see them, genetically in our modern dog populations. My favorite thing about this is a wolf. I think it's a wolf. I don't think it's a dog. But the fascinating for me, the most fascinating thing about it is both of those little pup wolves, their last meals, they opened up their stomachs, they removed little bits of frozen tissue in there. They did the genomic work on that. Their last meals were woolly rhinoceros, which is pretty wild, right? And this is the power of this genomic stuff. We would never be able to tell this without this kind of information, which is really quite interesting. Now, beyond the genomics work, there's all kinds of other science that we can bring to the bring to the game here to try to figure out how people related to their dogs in the past. And the genomic research still shows us some interesting things. So these same studies have showed us that dogs in parts of the world began to develop genetic adaptations for digesting starches. They have increases in the count number of the AMY2B gene. I know that probably doesn't mean anything, but they have this increase. They have a genetic adaptation to digesting starches. And that's because those dogs are living in communities, human communities, that are dominated by grains. They're in agricultural communities. So you see dogs genetically adapting to being in those grain-rich environments 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. But this is long after. This is 10,000 years after they were supposedly domesticated, yet we see them still evolving in new ways to be with us, right? So this is just genomic evidence that definitively tells us and shows us the ongoing evolution of dogs. Wolves don't have this ability. They don't need to have this ability to eat bread, right, or to eat grain. And even dogs that don't live in agricultural communities don't have these adaptations. They don't need them, right? You go to Inuit dogs, don't have high count numbers of those genes. They don't live in a grain-rich environment. They live in a meat and fat-rich environment. So dog evolution, dog histories with us are incredibly variable. The final thing I wanted to mention about the genomic research is that it shows us the way in which humans and dogs have traveled together, have been together, have moved together over the long term. So the figure on the left-hand side there, genomic research in Europe has shown that 7,000, 8,000 years ago, human groups began to move out of the Near East, coming into Europe with domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and they moved into Europe, intermixed, and replaced populations that were there. And when they did so, they encountered people that were already there, they encountered dogs that were already there, and you can see mixing of the genetics of the dogs, mixing in the genetics of the people. So we come with dogs. And that's the case in Europe, it's the case in the Americas, where you have multiple waves of people coming to the Americas, probably from the very get-go. First Nations have dogs, bringing them with them into the Americas. Every year, there seems to be earlier and earlier dogs found here, 12,000, 13,000 years ago now in Alaska. Very, very long-standing relationship. The most famous human dog migration in the Americas is, of course, the Inuit, who emerged in the Bering Strait area about 2,000 years ago and then moved all the way across the Arctic, bringing with them their very special breeds of sled dogs. So we can see this genetically, we can see it morphologically. It's quite interesting. And it tells us, it gives us hints about these intimate relationships that people had with their dogs. We can also see, you think about my dog eating sausages there, that humans and dogs have been table mates for the long term. Dogs in the past ate what people ate. And we can see this through something called stable isotope analyses. So basically, it's chemical analysis of the collagen in the bone, and it tells us about general food groups in the diet. How much, let's say, salmon a dog was eating, or how much bison a dog was eating, or these sorts of general types of food in the diet. And generally speaking, when you look at this globally, we've got dogs in Hokkaido in Japan. Those dogs have diets that very closely mirror the people that they're living with. They're eating the same things. It's what's efficient to do, but it's also what people are feeding their dogs, their own food, right? And that relationship is thousands and thousands of years old, okay? Also lots of indications that dogs contributed in the past in various ways. I mean, of course, dogs were used were taking part in hunting. They were providing us protection. They were providing us companionship. They were also, of course, helping in transport. The earliest case where we have dog remains found side by side with the remains of sleds are in the northeastern Siberian Arctic 9,000 years ago. That's amazing. And they're big dogs, probably participating, helping, doing their role in that multi-species community to help move people on the landscape. And here on the Canadian prairies, I just love this picture. This is a dog down the Qu'Appelle Valley in southern Saskatchewan, pulling a travois, and these were used as dogs help to move camp, move people on the prairies. It's just an A-shaped frame that rests on the back of the dog. We have no idea how long this has been around, but I assume that it's thousands upon thousands of years old, and dogs have been contributing to those communities in remarkable ways for the very, very long term. Probably what I'm most known for, what I'm most cited for, is my work on dog burials. Dogs are the most widely buried animals in the past. They're found on every continent. The oldest dog burial is 14,000 years old. A dog was buried with people in a cave near Bonn Oberkassel in Germany. People have been burying dogs for a long time, and I've argued that this is evidence of a close emotional and social bond between dogs. I've argued that it indicates that people understood dogs to have souls and to have an afterlife, and that people were, in effect, giving dogs funerals when they died as gestures of respect, as gestures of reciprocity to an animal that gave their life to people. And you can see this materially in these dog burials. I think it's one of the most beautiful ways in which we can see this from an archaeological perspective. And just to show you an example of one of my favorites, the dog buried here on the right from a place called Ust-Belya. This is not far from Irkutsk in southern Siberia. The dog was placed into a pit in the ground, a grave. There's antlers, there's other animal bones placed beside it. And then on both sides of its neck were two pendants made from the teeth of red deer. The dog's wearing a necklace when it was buried. And the remarkable thing about that is there are human graves just a few meters away. They're wearing the same kinds of necklace. So it's just a person, but not a human person, and it's being given mortuary rites and sent into the afterlife. I love this topic. I think it's a beautiful thing, a remarkable thing, and it shows us that our love of dogs, the ones that were running around under the tables here earlier, is nothing new, right? It's a long-standing thing, and shouldn't be surprising, given what these dogs were doing for those human communities that they participated in. And then, just to ruin the mood, it's also important to recognize that dogs were also sacrificed and eaten in the past. It's very, very clear. I mean, this is an animal that gives and gives and gives, and even in death has given to people, allowing them to do what they consider to be a proper feeding people and so on and so forth. Just to give you an example, and this is a worldwide practice, it is not limited. In Europe, prior to the Roman period, evidence for consuming dogs is very, very widespread. So it was something that was practiced everywhere, not where you might suspect. So I'm going to leave on that depressing note. We're going to turn to the most inspirational work that I've ever done in my life, and that is thinking about reindeer domestication and working with Nenets reindeer herders. So unlike dogs, research on reindeer domestication has been very limited. There's been very little scientific study compared to dogs. The best of this research has been done quite recently, led by my colleague and friend Anna-Kaisa Salmi in Finland. Her research team's doing fantastic work on this topic, but it's relatively unknown. It's little studied compared to dogs. In some ways, I guess, because we're just not as familiar with the animal, we haven't spent as much time trying to figure out its past. So as I said before, there are lots of models, and it's just storytelling about how these relationships began. Perhaps began in southern boreal forest in Asia, people living next to people with horses, adopting those practices. They see with horses, applying them to reindeer, and then this initiated the process of reindeer domestication. So on the right-hand side, maybe among Tungusic speakers in the Russian Far East or northern China, or maybe in the Altai among Samoyedic speakers. But there's also been independent domestications proposed in Northern Europe, among the Chukchi and Chukotka, and among the folks who have lived in Yamal, the Nenets and their Hanti kin, that I'm going to focus on here in my talk. Again, there's no archaeological evidence really for any of this. It's very unclear where these relationships began. So about 10 years ago, we started doing work in the Yamal Peninsula of Arctic Siberia. And this is an area that is a global center of reindeer domestication. There are 10,000 people, 10,000 indigenous people living in Yamal that live mobile lifestyles with reindeer. Some of them migrate, 1,000 kilometers a year with their reindeer. Some of the herds that people keep are in the thousands, some are in the hundreds, and people live very close, intimate lives and are dependent upon their reindeer. So it is an ideal place to do this kind of work because we can work with people who understand those animals the best, who have a long history in that area, and most importantly, I can ask them their opinions about these objects. We can work respectfully and collaboratively together on the topic to try to understand it more thoroughly. And all that being said, I'm not a Nenets expert. Nenets is the ethnic group that I worked with. The Nenets are an expert on Nenets. I'm not even really an expert on reindeer, but I know a little bit. And what I'm telling you about today is what they shared with me and have given me permission to speak about. So let's look a little bit at the history and the archaeology of reindeer in Yamal and think about how confusing and contradictory it is, and think about why we started doing this work in the first place. So the historic records from Yamal indicate that the entire time that people are putting written records together, that people had domestic reindeer. But those records indicate that about prior to roughly 300 years ago, people kept relatively small herds, tens, maybe 100 animals, and they primarily ate wild reindeer that they got through hunting. They would do fishing, but the herds were really used for transport. They were used for pulling sleds rather than a primary data source. Wild reindeer were the source. So we started doing genetics on archaeological reindeer from the area. The genetics show something sort of in contrast, that all of the region's modern domestic reindeer arrived only 500 years ago. So you'd think from the genetic evidence, people didn't have domestic reindeer here until 500 years ago. Well, the archaeologists don't believe it, and I can tell you the Nenets and the Hanti think this is a ridiculous idea, right? They're like, reindeer have been with us for a very, very long time. And the archaeology has hints to this. So one, we have people living way out in the tundra, in the middle of the tundra, by about 900 years ago. And everybody that works locally thinks, well, this is probably because people had reindeer to pull sleds, to move people, to move gear out into the middle of the tundra in order for people to hunt wild reindeer that were migrating through the area. And most interestingly, and what I'll talk about here a little bit, is that you start to see these objects show up archaeologically that look like they're the parts of reindeer bridles, the headgear that reindeer wear when they're pulling sleds. They look sort of like what's used in the region today and sort of not like that. So just to show you what these things look like, they include things like on the bottom left, these swivels that are carved from antler. It's just like a swivel that you might use on fishing line, except it's this big. It's a big, robust swivel made out of antler. Swivels are used in reindeer gear today. I'll show you these in a second. And then there are all of these L-shaped pieces. Some of them have barbs on them, and some of them don't. And these look like L-shaped pieces that are parts of Nenets and Hanti bridles today. So let me just show you that quickly. So here is a reindeer out on the tundra of Yamal, and if you can make out in the photos are a bit washed out, but it's got all these leather straps going to its head, and then on one side of its head, it's got an L-shaped piece of antler that's joined to another L-shaped piece of antler on its head that kind of brackets its face, right? And then from that headgear, going backwards, is a line, and the line The blue line you can see there on the right-hand side goes back to the person driving the sled. And at the base of that line is a swivel, and the swivel prevents that line from being twisted up. So we see these L-shaped pieces, and they're shaped a lot like the stuff that we have 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years prior to today's domestic reindeer seemingly arrive in the region. So obviously, like, we're living in and working in an environment where we're surrounded by reindeer herders. Who best to ask about what these objects are than people who know reindeer? Like, I grew up in Kansas. I never saw a reindeer until I arrived there. Like, if it was something to do with cows or maybe dogs, I'd be able to help you out, but I didn't know what this stuff was. So what we did is we went to the archaeological collections, which are curated in Yamal, with a scanner, 3D scanner. We scanned them all in. We brought the models, digital models, back to Edmonton. We printed them out in PVC, and then I bought a bunch of reindeer antler from a reindeer farm here in Alberta, and then we cut them up in my backyard, used power tools and all sorts of drills and files, and we made exact replicas of the archaeological objects that we took with us then to people in the community and then eventually onto the tundra to get their evaluation of those objects. And you can see my dog. This was a short-lived experiment in the backyard. You can't have your dog around while you're sawing up antler because it's just too good, right? It smells too good. So her nose was right there, and I was like, that's a jigsaw, an inch from your nose. You're going in the house. She again wasn't pleased. And I don't remember if she left me a present on the carpet that day. Okay. So like I said, we have these replicas. We start out in town. And we meet with herders who are staying in town, that live in town, and they're trying to explain to us, and they have their gear there. They don't have reindeer there, right? They've got all the straps, they've got the headgear. So you can see on the left, they are like, how are we going to get these idiots to figure out what we're talking about? So they take out a piece of plywood, and we're holding them up plywood, and they're putting the strapping on the plywood, and I still don't understand what they're talking about. Then one of the guys you can see on the right-hand side, he puts the headgear on himself. He's laughing away. We all had a good chuckle out of this, but at some point they were like, you guys need to go to the tundra. You need to be around reindeer. You need to see this firsthand in order to understand it. And I love these pictures because the Nenets were the friendliest, happiest people I've ever been around in my life. And compared to academics, they were a bloody joy to be around, okay? So we took their advice. We came back the next year. We had a grant. We flew into Salihard. We took a helicopter all the way to the north end of the tundra. We're 500 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. We met with some local Nenets there. They were guides to get us out to our host family. We didn't just show up. One of the folks that I worked with had lived with the family before. Their son had lived with him in the city, so we had a long-term existing relationship with the family. We asked ahead of time. We try to do things respectfully. Can you imagine if a bunch of foreign idiots just showed up to your house and said, "Hey, we're going to stay with you for a month"? We didn't do that, but we were clear up on the tundra. We got ready to get on the snowmobile. And they took a look at us, and I'm there. I'm clad head to toe in Canada Goose down. I spent probably $1,000 on my parka, and they looked at me and they said no. They put us in their clothes, all of which were made from reindeer, and I'll show you an example of this before. I was really resistant because I was an idiot, and I was very happy about an hour later that I was wearing their clothes and not my own clothes, because they were far superior to what I had brought with me. So we traveled 24 hours on snowmobile, met our host family on the north end of the tundra. They live in a chum. It's a teepee. They have snowmobiles, they have reindeer herding dogs, and then they're herds of reindeer, and they're mobile on the landscape with those animals. And we got to experience that life for about a month. The way we did the archaeological parts of this, which really kind of became not even the main point, we took those replicas that we had printed out, and we would set around a little table in the chum, in the tent, and they would be passed around. And because I was a weird foreigner there, lots of people came to visit. In a month, I think we had 2 days where we didn't have visitors. So it's very social, very warm, loving environment. And people would come and we'd pull these out of the box and they would get passed around. They would discuss in Nenets. Then they would talk to us about them in Russian, and then it would be translated to me in English because my Russian's horrible. And then they would give us our opinions on these things, some of which go back about 2,000 years. So some of the objects, and they had an interesting way of talking about them. They would say either the objects are ours, these are ours, these belong to us, we know what they are, this is what we use. The swivels, they said, these are ours. In fact, some people remembered their fathers or grandfathers making these swivels out of antler not so long ago. So they just thought, yeah, this is definitely reindeer herding gear. They had no doubt about it. Okay, so the swivels, they are ours. We used to make them just like this. The L-shaped pieces without the barbs, they said, these are ours. But these pieces with the barbs on them, the little pointy bits, they didn't like them. And they were like, the point was this would hurt the reindeer, right? So you put this on their head, it's going to agitate the head. They don't like to treat their animals roughly. They said this would agitate the head. And they debated and debated and debated, and you can see them compared side by side with some of their modern gear. And then everyone more or less came to the consensus that these were objects that were used for training reindeer, with the idea being with an inexperienced reindeer, you would put this headgear on it once or twice, it would put up resistance, and this is what they do, thrashing that head around, and it would feel that pressure on the head and be like, okay, I'm not going to be resistant anymore, and then you would discontinue its use. They said this is definitely not day-to-day gear. It would hurt the animals, we would never use this, which is very, very interesting. But what was really revealing here is being a part of that process. So they showed us how they train reindeer, how they engage with their reindeer, and it was beautifully informative about how domestication is this loving relationship that involves commitment, and it involves work, and it involves day-to-day effort, and in fact is an ongoing relationship. So one of the ways in which our host family would do this is every few days they would gather a portion of the herd, the male portion of the herd. It was calving season when we were there. Male and female herds separated. They would take a snowmobile or a reindeer-pulled sled out onto the tundra with the herding dog, and then they would very gently move the herd over to where the chum was. And this was very, very slow, very, very calm. The reindeer are experienced with this. They know what's happening. And then we would come towards the chum, and there would be a very makeshift corral. And it was just a little bit of netting, a couple of posts, and some sleds. And then because we were helpless children there, our role was to be fence post. So we would just stand there, try to keep the reindeer from escaping the corral. But the way in which it was actually enacted was beautiful. So they would move the reindeer near the corral, and the female head of the household standing there on the left would hold a single line of rope out about 20 meters. The reindeer would not cross that. They just did not like it. On the opposite side of the corral, men would stand with lassos. And the female head of the household would sing. She would go, hey, hey. And I have a terrible voice. Hers was beautiful, but she would go, hey, 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 hey. And the reindeer would just begin to mosey into the corral very, very gently. Most of them. And then there would be some ornery rascals that would try to go around the outside of the corral. And then there were the men of the household with lassos, would lasso, pull them on the antlers typically, pull them into the corral. And there were also rascals within the corral that would wait until as soon as you weren't looking and they would duck under. But they're so gregarious, they're such herd animals, and they know their people and they know their other reindeer that when they escape from the corral, guess what they would do? They would just go stand behind it, right? They didn't leave. They're just like, I don't want to be in there, but I'm not leaving. These are my people, right? And this is exactly how they explained it, getting reindeer to know their people, which I thought was a very beautiful thing. So the process of training reindeer for pulling the sled then involved the men from the household going into this swirling mass of reindeer in the corral, putting a reindeer in a headlock, and then dragging it out. We do 3, 1 older experienced reindeer and 2 younger reindeer. And the experienced reindeer was hooked up to the main lead. The inexperienced reindeer were paired by its side, and then they were attached to the sled. And then the sled would go out onto the tundra, with the idea being that the inexperienced reindeer learn from the experienced reindeer how to engage in the process. So it's kind of multiple generations enacted in that sled pulling all at once. So it's, for me, it was training. They didn't call it training. They were just getting them accustomed to doing that sort of behavior. And it worked beautifully well, and it's a wonderful way to travel in the tundra because really all you hear is a heavy breathing reindeer and the little clicking of their feet. You don't get the blast of snow in your face if you're on a sled behind a snowmobile or the sound. So it's a beautiful way to be on the landscape. So we referred to this as mutual enskillment. It's not that the reindeer are learning, they are, but it's also the people that learn. They learn the dispositions of the reindeer. So those that are really resistant to this, that won't cooperate, they get eaten, they get sold, they get sold on market, right? They go out of the herd. It's this ongoing, really kind of selection for friendliness we talked about earlier on with domestication. That's still being enacted. But the reindeer come to know the people come to know the reindeer, and the way in which this was really struck home for me was they were terrified that we were going to get lost because I couldn't figure out north, south. I could barely figure out up from down. Like I was very, very disoriented because there was no vegetation. It was a white undulating landscape and oftentimes a whitish sky. I was lost all the time. So their instructions to us were to never leave the yard beyond the point at which you can't see the top of the teepee, the top of the chum, because they were so afraid we were going to get lost. And if we got lost, our instructions were to find reindeer. And I was like, why do you want us to find reindeer? He's like, Hadrianisi, the male head of the household, said, find reindeer and scare them and follow them, because when the reindeer are scared, they go to their people and they'll take you to where people are. And this will save you if you're lost in the tundra. I thought that was beautiful and insightful. And it gave me a little bit of relief that I knew what to do if I got lost, because there were several times I fell off the sled. Okay. They also, and this will lead to bathroom joke number 2, there are also a number of things that people clearly did as acts of reciprocity to the animals that they were working with, gestures to make the animals know that their efforts were appreciated, and to keep them around, right? One of those things was offering protection. So in the calving season, the number one predator on the calves are actually Arctic foxes. And you had to always have a herder there with them to protect the calves from the Arctic foxes, because they could very easily, and they did very easily, kill the Arctic foxes. And in cases where we would take some of the reindeer out and have them pull the sled, they would come back into the yard and they would feed them with pieces of bread, as to restore their strength, but also a way to kind of thank them for the efforts that they just put out. But the most unexpected and, for me, alarming means of enticing reindeer, how best to explain this? Well, reindeer love salt, okay? The predominant source of salt out in the tundra when it's snow-covered is human urine, okay? So I learned this firsthand. So imagine yourself, you're in the chum, you've had 10 cups of tea, and you're just holding it, like, I gotta go outside, and it's cold, right? It's cold, it's windy, and I'm wearing a knee-length parka, I'm wearing long pants, and I walk out into the tundra, I go over the hill for some privacy. This is the way you do. There's a men's side and a women's side, and you're like, wow, this is really a beautiful place to go to the bathroom, right? And you start to prepare yourself. So you're pulling up your parka, and you're pulling down your pants. It's very undignified. I didn't know how to do it properly. Was not used to wearing the clothing. And you see reindeer here and there, and they definitely see you, okay? So you start to relieve yourself, and then you're not approached by reindeer, you are rushed by reindeer, okay? Full on top of you, running reindeer, and it's a struggle because your pants are around your ankles, right? You're holding up a parka, and sometimes they come from behind. Like, my number one fear was peeing on one of their heads, okay, honestly. But what happens is when you go, they are there and they eat every molecule of urine that's placed into the snow because they need that salt in their system. And it's a way of enticing them, it's a way of keeping this way. One of the reasons they stay around humans is because we provide this to them rather incidentally. That's my last bathroom joke for today. So in many ways, it's very, very clear in these relationships of domestication that we are bound together. Life is made possible by reindeer, most beautifully exemplified by the clothing. Here's my colleague from the University of Saskatchewan wearing a women's parka, a yagushka, beautifully made, beautifully designed, wonderfully warm garment. It's made beautiful because they like beautiful things, but also to show respect for the animal who gave its life to make that garment, and also Arctic fox and so on. The architecture itself is there to accommodate the needs of reindeer. You have to be mobile. You have to be able to move quickly. So your whole setup, what you have, is really dependent upon your relationship with the reindeer. You're bound to them as much as they are bound to you. Who's controlling who in this relationship is pretty ambiguous. You're eating reindeer are life itself for you. The covering of the tomb in winter, reindeer hide, right? They're providing you shelter even in death in very, very beautiful, beautiful ways. So I'll just in there and say thank you and introduce you to Ladakh. Ladakh was my host family's lead reindeer herding dog and a lovely, lovely boy. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to come around with the mic, and we'll be monitoring online as well for any questions for Robert. So if you do want to ask a question, I'll come over and bring the mic to you.
Thank you, Dr. Losey, for your fascinating talk. I have a bit of an unusual story. I actually grew up around the only free-ranging herd of reindeer in the UK. So I'm very connected with reindeer and somewhat connected with Sami people who introduced them. I was really interested to kind of ask you if they talked about kind of the well-being side of things. I know from my own experiences that they're incredibly empathetic animals. You know, as a child, I was tiny, I'd fall over, they would come, they would support you. You know, you felt like you were sort of being watched and being looked after. And I just wondered if they talked at all about the role of that in terms of their family structure.
Help if I meant the microphone, right? Yes. We didn't get into that directly, but indirectly, I would say yes. And I remember Hadri Nisi, the male head of the household, saying to me, it's like when their kids, their children would go to a boarding school on the coastline, and he says when we pick up our kids, the first thing they always ask about are their reindeer and their dogs. And I think that gets to that relationship, although we didn't discuss that at length. But people clearly loved their reindeer, and the reindeer clearly knew their people well. Yeah.
All right, more questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you again. That was an amazing presentation. I was just curious, it seems like reindeer herding it's such an extreme environment, and it would be so hard to start the domestication process. And I know that we started with dogs in an extreme environment because their social structures are kind of closely related to ours, where they have familial bonds, things like that.
Yeah.
Did you find that in the reindeer herding at all, that their social structure allowed for that start of the domestication process, possibly?
I haven't myself, although it has been written about. One of the advantageous things with reindeer is that they're so gregarious, they will stay together. So keeping them together in a herd is not so challenging in some ways. They will really stay bound to one another because of the way they are naturally. that may have contributed to it. But actually finding material evidence of that is nearly impossible. Like, it's going to become a story about how it happened rather than being able to show that happened. So we didn't find that. Although I think you're absolutely right. There has to be things about the social world of reindeer that contributed to their domestication. Definitely. What exactly those were, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. What do you think are the lessons that, I think most of us in here are dealing with maybe more urban population of animals. What do you think the lessons are from your research that you would want to see in our research?
People have asked me this question many times, and I'm never quite sure what to say. This is what I've said before. And I'll just use dogs as an example. We can learn a lot from dogs, and that's because dogs are friendly, and they recognize the importance of others. Dogs are not meant to be alone. And we can see this in the distant past, and we can see this with our own dogs today. And rather than thinking that domestication is something that we've done to dogs or other animals, it's really a gift for us, these relationships and the models that those animals provide in their relationships can be useful for thinking. What I'm saying is we should live like the friendliest dogs. We should greet people. We should love the people around us. We should recognize the importance of others. I think that if there is a lesson in the work, that's probably it. That's the most profound answer I can give you to that question. Yeah.
We've got some questions online, so I'll read them out. The first one is, thanks for your amazing talk and work. Any thoughts on the current or potential impacts of climate change warming on this lifestyle for both humans and reindeer?
Yeah, it's terrifying. The Arctic is warming. The big threat to reindeer herders, there are many. One is you have rain now occurring on the snow. They call them rain on snow events. It creates a layer of ice on top of the snow. The reindeer cannot or struggle to dig through that to access the lichens underneath, and you have starvation that can result. The southern portion of the tundra is greening. It's becoming filled with shrubs instead of lichen-dominated vegetation. Also a major outcome of climate warming. And then, getting back to the cause of climate warming, there are huge oil and gas facilities on the Yamal Peninsula that are part of that same mess, and they take up land and they destroy tundra. You can take the train halfway up the tundra to reach the oil facilities. There's that much development that far in the Arctic. So there are many, many threats. Some of them are environment, and some of them are, once again, us.
And we've got one more question from online right now. Are the animals used in education of young people at all?
Yes, in many different ways. There's great effort in the community that we were in to have kids educated both in a school in town, but also on the tundra. They're sort of mobile teachers that go from chum to chum to work with kids. And very early on, kids learn how to handle reindeer. Anisi, who was 12 years old when I was there, 12 years old, he would take me on the reindeer sled out on the tundra to check the herds. He would spend all night on the tundra, all night on the clock. It was light day round. He would spend 12 hours on the tundra by himself fending off Arctic foxes at 12 years of age to help his herd. So the kids are very much involved in daily life. He also tried to get me to do his chores repeatedly too, which was, so he's a clever boy. I was a giant plaything for him. So, yeah. But in terms of other forms of learning, the learning really involves engaging with the animals rather than, directly engaging with the animals, that's the learning that children are involved with directly.
And we've got a question in the room back here.
I was interested in what you were saying about how the reindeer herdsmen are passively, in a way, but selectively doing some breeding, I suppose, by culling the herd of those who don't have the right behaviors they're looking for. And of course, when we're talking about dogs, we're talking about very selective breeding over many, many years. I'm wondering if you've heard of a dog called Mutton, who was deliberately shaped in terms of its development for, they're telling us, as long ago as 10,000 years. There was a pelt that was forwarded to the National Museum of History in Washington, and when they did DNA testing and looked at it, they found that they had been breeding dogs to have a woolly coat that was very much like sheep's wool. They're extinct now, I gather. Have you heard of that story, and was that true? Do you think that it could have gone back that far?
Yeah, that pelt, I've seen that pelt. That's from New Chalmouth, Salish-speaking Indigenous folks on the west coast of Vancouver Island, one of their dogs, and it was a breed of dogs that they bred for their wool, and they were shaved down, used to weave blankets. There's only one pelt I know of that exists, and it is indeed in the Smithsonian, and I happened to be there when some Salish ladies from Puget Sound were there visiting, and they all like, oh, we want to go see the woolly dog pelt. And then I snuck in behind them to see it because I was super curious. But it's a very real theme. Yeah, definitely. Very, very old.
Other questions? We've still got some time up front here. I'll make my way.
Thank you. You sort of started, you touched on this sort of in the beginning, but how do you feel about highly derived, especially Western, modern domestic animal relationships being sort of represented as the standard for domestication?
Oh, it's misleading, very misleading. I mean, and I've written this, but I don't know if anyone's even noticed. But I don't really think that domestication is one thing. I mean, I think it's just some kind of catch-all that we use to throw all sorts of relationships into. I mean, the process of domesticating a carp and domesticating a horse, that can't be the same thing. I don't know how you breed a carp for friendliness, all right? Like, there's just an enormous amount of variation that's all being lumped under one thing. And the way in which we understand that dog domestication will not work for reindeer, and the reindeer will not work for the horse, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very misleading. Yeah, it's superficial treatment of a complex, variable set of relationships. Yeah.
Thanks for the interesting talk. Forgive me if you talked about this at the beginning. I was a little bit late to the talk. But can you talk about your perspective on the role of epigenetics versus random mutation in domestication? I've read a few papers talking about the role of potentially epigenetic selection at the very beginning that really sped up maybe some of these relationships and changed our perspective of how domestication might have began.
Let me give you an honest answer. I don't know enough about those topics to say anything meaningful. So I won't, yes. Yeah, sorry. There are better people to ask. There are probably better people in the room to ask that question to than me.
Great answer. Other questions? Oh, we've got one here, and then I'll come to the back. We've got a question online.
Thank you. This isn't so much a question as a thought. So when you were describing domestication, it overlaps very much with the definition a lot of us use for the human-animal bond.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that's just a thought, and I was really struck by that. And maybe there's more of a room in our field for historians too. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, I actually see exactly what you mean, and I think there's a lot of overlap between those things, although you can certainly have a bond with an animal that's not domestic as well. But I agree that I think the bond is central to many of those relationships, not all of them, but I mean, people domesticated silkworms. I don't know of any worms that had close bonds with people, but I never asked one, right? But the human-animal bond is important in many of those relationships.
We've got a question online. So there's somebody who is curious about the difference of our, people's understanding of the dog-human relationship across various cultures. So they're just wondering if you could comment on your understanding of that.
I mean, it's extremely variable. It's extremely variable. There are places where dogs are considered dirty, where they're considered impure, and they're in places where they're the exact opposite. They're the purest, sweetest thing that there can be, right? The depth of those relationships historically is surely very, very complex. I don't understand how all of those differences have played out. Even within like the major world religions, dogs are understood quite differently, right? It's not a universal thing, but generally speaking, you can see archaeological evidence for bonds with dogs almost everywhere, in my opinion. But it's not with all dogs, and it's not with all people, and it's not at all times. So the only way to answer that question is, there's a lot of variability, even today, right?
I have a question on affection. Since domestication is an ongoing process, like you said, there's no end, when do you think affection became such a prevalent thing in dogs especially? And in the future, however many years from now, do you think it will still be like affection as the primary relationship between humans and dogs, or do you think this affection will turn into something different?
I think the affection issue emerged very, very, very early in the history of domestication. I don't think we would see them buried 14,000 years ago if that bond wasn't present since the beginning. People often ask me, like, what do I think the most remarkable thing about dogs is? And they're just profoundly good at being social outside of their species, right? You can be social with people, you can be social with sheep, right? Or whatever it is. And that is probably an ability that is very long-standing and maybe only partially emerged during domestication. I mean, wolves are incredibly social as well. I mean, probably less so outside of their species. But I think it's very, very long-standing and has been a part of that history forever. And I don't know how it's going to go forward, but I hope it doesn't end, because that's my favorite part about the relationship. It's not cleaning up my carpet.
Other questions? Got time. Oh. If you are wanting to ask a question, just raise your hand high.
There's one in the back corner.
Oh, I'm sorry. There you are.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So I did my dissertation fieldwork up in La Ronge with woodland caribou, and I really was interested in what you had to say about the domestication of reindeer. While I was doing my fieldwork, I heard stories about attempted domestication of caribou in Canada. I was wondering if you could speak to that and what might be the differences. From what I heard, it really didn't work, and participants were pretty emphatic that there was something about caribou that just precluded domestication.
I don't know anything particularly about those attempts, although people have tried. I know people have tried, and they've tried with moose in some cases. The usual response to those, it could be the same thing with wolves. People have tried just hand-raising wolves at home, and most of those attempts are not very successful either. But the idea being that there was, within reindeer and caribou. They're the same genus and species, most of them. There will be only a very small subset of very special animals that were, just because of their characteristics, very well suited to engage in those kind of relationships. It's you can't just do it with any old caribou. They don't they don't like it. That's not their place in the world. But there were some that, a very small group of them that are, and that's, and even if you look genetically, like with most of these animals, it seems to be a single domestication. It seems to be a very small founding population, and depending upon the animal, some of them remain very isolated from the rest of their wild kin. Dogs seem to do this, maybe. But other animals intermix with wild again and again and again and still maintain kind of a domestic relationship. But my point is that not all it would take generations upon generations of us to find the right reindeer or right caribou to do that with. And then we'd have to ask the ethical question of, should we be doing that in the first place anyway? Yeah.
We've got another question online. So this person is interested in the reindeer herding dogs, and they would like to know, did you learn about the methods that were used to teach or train those herding dogs? And was there anything that stood out to you about the relationship or practice?
Oh yeah, they are awesome. So to put it shortly, so when you come into a Nenets village, typically we would be on a snowmobile. All you can hear is a snowmobile, and then the next thing, all you can hear is a barking dog that's biting you as you come into the neighborhood, because they're very territorial. They don't teach them to do this. They do it innately. We asked, how do you train those dogs to herd reindeer? And they're like, we don't train them. They do it naturally. It's our job to make sure they do it with purpose and that they are not aggressive. So they really saw it as kind of guiding the dog to do what it naturally did, just helping, encouraging it to do that the right way. So they said they didn't train the dogs. There was no training, and you could clearly see though that when they would send Ladakh, the lead dog out, sometimes they would send a young dog with them to see. So I'm not sure if the Nenets were training the dog or Ladakh was training the other dog. They kind of did it like with the reindeer, by pairing experienced to inexperienced and allowing them to figure that relationship out. So I would say Nenets, my host family would say they don't train their dogs. They know how to do it. Yeah. But they could voice command them from a long way away, could shout instructions. Sometimes Ladakh would get tired. You'd see them yell in Nenets, go back out. He'd look dejected and then take off and just go and do his job beautifully. But not trained as far as I could tell.
Any other questions? Oh, over here.
Thank you for that really fascinating talk. I just wanted to build on some of the conversation about connections between how we understand human-animal bond and domestication. I'm just wondering about some of the contemporary relationships we have now with dogs, for example, like assistance animals and emotional support animals. I'm wondering whether you have anything to say about the potential value of thinking about those types of relationships through the lens of progressive domestication.
In other cases where animals were providing that kind of assistance in the past?
Well, I'm just wondering what it brings, I suppose, to our field to understanding those relationships or studying them if we open ourselves up to thinking more through the lens of domestication as opposed to just human-animal bond. Perhaps there is no added value, that's just the question.
Yeah.
What it might bring.
I would have to think about that more to give you a meaningful answer. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's yeah.
Well,
I haven't thought about that.
You've got me thinking. It's really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yeah, share your ideas with this about me with me. Yeah, I haven't thought about that issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, I'm wondering if you have come across one of the latest books by Mark Bekoff, where he co-authored and was looking at, this kind of think piece of what would happen to dogs if humans just suddenly were no longer on this earth, and how would they fare? And so, given all that you know about this long history, what are your thoughts on how dogs would do without us?
Yeah, I think I've seen some movies about this. It would be quite interesting to see how things played out, and what dogs would revert to after being kind of set free from us, or if we weren't around at all. I mean, we have no modern situation where that's really happened. I mean, the dingo is a feralized dog, but they were feralized in a place that had been peopled for 50,000 years. So it's not the same. But without us entirely, it would be very compelling to see the direction that one of the things I think we would end up with, all of the dogs with really extreme body forms, head shapes, would be out of the population fairly quickly. Their anatomy is built for appearance, and they persist because of help from us, and they can't effectively bite or hunt or et cetera. So I think that would diminish. I think the body size variation would probably be massively reduced. The huge guys and the little guys would go away. If we'd end up with something more coyote-like and wolf-like, I don't know. That's an interesting idea. I haven't, that's in the realm of science fiction, but it's a very interesting set of ideas, for sure.
Look, personally, I don't want to imagine that one.
Yes,
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Any final questions? Yes.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. Kind of going along with the what ifs. I think those of us who are cat people are I am familiar with the mummification and royalty in Egypt putting their cats in. What I found fascinating about your talk was it seemed as though the individuals who were burying their dogs were just normal folks who were just burying them as, a loved one. And so I thought that was very fascinating. I don't have a question. Just wanted to bring up cats in that, so.
Yes, there are always good cat people. So the earliest cat burial in the world that I'm aware of is on Cyprus, and it's 10,000 years old. So people have had close bonds. In that case, they're not even sure whether it was quote-unquote domestic or not, but cats are not naturally on Cyprus, so people brought it there, and then it ended up being buried. So that relationship, those bonds, are old, very old as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.